global institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are walking a very tightrope right now. Today, at the first media briefing for the week's spring meetings, the World Bank President, David Malpass, says he's deeply concerned about developing countries as they face sudden price increases for energy, fertilizer, and food, and the likelihood of interest rates increases. This, plus other overlapping crises such as the war in Ukraine and COVID-19 shutdowns, according to David Malpass, are pushing growth rates lower and poverty rates higher. And there's more crises around debt, currency, healthcare, and more on the horizon. Joining me to review the agenda, the outlook, and policy responses for the 2022 spring meetings is development economist Professor Ken Ife. Professor Ife is live to us from our Abuja studios this evening. Sir, we thank you for coming through, and let's get started. Let me ask you, what's your view of the annual meetings of these Bretton Woods institutions and what they have achieved so far?
It's a good forum for all kinds of dialogue, and you know you can never have too much dialogue. And so I do commend them for organizing it very well. And they allow civil societies to take a center stage. So apart from their statutory financial meetings of the Finance Committee and Development Committee, and they have regional aspects, they make announcements on regional positions and things, and then also have some forecasts, statistical forecasts on growth rates and all kinds of things. So it's very, very useful, at least in raising alarm when there is the specter of a global crisis of some dimension, as they have just done on food and energy.
Well, give me an agenda for this week's annual meetings starting today.
Oh, very varied agenda. You have the statutory meetings, which is recurring decimal, and then you have especially the one on development and the one on finance. But then you have a plethora of meetings, side meetings, with loaded agenda. Anything you can think of, from climate change to growth, slowing down of the global economy, food crisis, tensions in all parts. They have and then of course diversity and gender, because Malala is there, could talk to the president of the IMF. So, and our lady is also there too. The Deputy Secretary General, Amina, she's also speaking. So it's very rich agenda and very diverse.
Well, very diverse, but again, I'm just trying to show what the key topics which the IMF and the World Bank says is going to be the main discourse for this week's spring meetings. I'm going to bring that up. Human capital is on top of that. But if you just go down, you find that fragility and conflict now, which is number 5 on the key topics that was publicized by the World Bank and the IMF just a few days ago. You can find that anywhere online. It says fragility and conflict seem to have dominated. Perhaps if you just add climate finance, seem to dominate the key issues that everyone is talking about on planet Earth right now.
Yeah, fragility will never go away, except that it has been exacerbated by the Russian-Ukraine crisis. And that immediately raises the issue around food security. Because, you know, both of them are the biggest supplier of wheat, and then also sugar cane for sugar. Sugar is even more expensive than anything now. So you can see the ripple, and of course energy, because Russia has, I think, maybe the second highest reserve.
Yes, that is conflict, Professor. Gas. Professor, if you allow me to respectfully cut in, that's conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But when we say economies are fragile without even conflict, have an issue. So what are we talking about here when we say economies are fragile, especially if you look at developing countries?
Well, fragility of economies really begin from conflict. That's the beginning. That's the beginning of the thing, because without conflict, with conflict, you can have economic development, you can have political stability. So that's always at the front burner. Then, of course, there are extreme poverty, and then the consequence of that is social upheaval and political violence. And many other things enter into the equation. Some are economic, some are social, some are political, some are you know, in the end of the day, what is the bottom line is conflict of one sort or the other. Especially, of course, you know, the climate change has its own dimension. So that is a recurring decimal.
So if you look at the list once again, do you think the conflict in Ukraine has exacerbated or has made worse trade and subsidies, climate finance, human capital? Do you think this particular conflict has made things worse, in your opinion?
No, it does make things worse because, you know, we have an interconnected global economy and world because one thing leads to the other. If you say, for example, the conflict, apart from the frontal implication on energy, of course, gas, and you know gas affects production of fertilizers, and fertilizers affect food supply. And then also the other source of the energy, as you're getting a high price of crude, but for some people, it's not good news because there's also all kinds of problems arising from very high cost. But the issues following those two major ones are the food that they produce, which are wheat. Wheat is very important, as well as sugar. Then the other one is that all the measures being taken to contain them, or all the ban this, ban that, restrict this, are also having knock-on effect on bank profitability, on financial. So there's financial turbulence on the way because when you, and of course it also affects trade as well because when people don't have enough money to order the goods. And in fact, even looking at the recommendations of these big boys that I've just spoken, you see that they are warning countries not to restrict export of food. Remember when that happened in 2020 because of COVID? They are warning because the World Food Program is out buying food. And they don't want this country to restrict export of food because they are buying them because of the enormity of the crisis. Look at how many millions of people that are displaced in Ukraine. They have to be fed. So these activities of the World Food Program of the United Nations is actually adding pressure to prices of agricultural products and then fueling inflation. So all of these things, they have knock-on effect and they're well interconnected. The ensuing financial crisis, the supply chain disruption, the energy palaver for the European Union, and the knock-on effect on high inflation, and you know, is everywhere. Even in America, they have prices of petroleum products going up, let alone the emerging economies.
So let's talk about the responses. I want your assessment of the response so far by the World Bank and the IMF. If we go down just over the last 2 years, close to 2.5 years in view of the COVID-19 pandemic to the current crisis in Ukraine, the World Bank President David Malpass says today that the board of the World Bank is considering additional $170 billion as a response, crisis response funding, which will be effective from this month of April to June of 2023. That's a statement released today from Washington because of the continuation of the Ukrainian crisis. Do you think that the World Bank and the IMF are on top of the situation, rambling all around with the COVID-19 pandemic? It hasn't really gone away. You got the news coming through from China and all of that. So do you think the responses are good and okay so far?
Well, I think they're trying, to be honest, because it's not our right to demand what we are getting, but I think they're doing really well. If you look at the World Bank, they responded fairly quickly by restructuring loans and then granting some more concessionary funding, and then also have a harmonized approach to debt treatment, which also made it possible for some countries to get some relief. Then, of course, on the IMF side, you saw them issue SDR, and that was useful. Nigeria got over $3 billion from that, and some countries that didn't actually need the special drawing rights had to, lend to some other countries. They enabled them buy COVID-19 vaccines. So, in all, I think they responded very well by easing the tension, and now they're even talking about financing imports, for example, just to make sure that we don't have major disruption on the supply chain. People who have the money to buy the goods rather than not buy them because they don't they are financially stretched. So they are looking at all of that. They're taking. That's why the WTO was there, saying, one, let's keep the trade flowing, even if it means further financing. And then secondly, those who are exporting the food, please continue to export. And so you can see the relevance of WTO in this. And then of course you have the FAO talking about agricultural productivity, increases in agricultural productivity. And then also all parties are saying, let's have more investment, more investment on agriculture. So it's also boiling down to give more loans, more concessional if you could.
And so we have challenges, and there are solutions offered by the World Bank and the IMF, and of course there are various sister organizations such as the IFC, MIGA, and all of that. So do you think these are boding well for frontier economies, especially here in Africa, including Nigeria?
I think they're making very important moves, but in the end of the day, the various governments have to be accountable on their fiscal responses and monetary policy responses. And I know that Nigeria is trying, because it could have been worse if we didn't have much more quantitative fiscal and monetary policy intervention. And that helped us to get out of recession within a quarter. But that cannot be said of many other countries. So one thing is to create the opportunity. The other one is for the respective countries to do good with what is on the table.
Okay, so here we have the World Bank and the IMF. They go to another meeting, the spring meetings this week. We started today. We're going to have the fiscal report tomorrow from the World Bank. But again, you're talking about the sovereigns themselves on the African continent, Frontier Africa. What cocktail of fiscal and monetary policy responses to these global challenges would you like to see from Africa's sovereigns, as we see the World Bank, for example, say it's pushing an additional $170 billion as a response to the crisis in Ukraine? The IMF is also looking at additional $52 billion over the next few days, which the board were expected to consider before the long Easter holiday. So $170 billion from the IMF, $50 billion or so from $170 billion from the World Bank, $50 billion from the IMF. So these guys are pushing the numbers. But again, as you said, African sovereigns will have to be responsible. So give me what you think the fiscal and monetary policy response should be on this side to meet what the Bretton Woods institutions are putting on the table.
One thing is to borrow money. These monies are not free. One thing is to borrow these monies. The next thing is to use them profitably and more responsibly to actually grow the economy and invest them in productive activities rather than send them down to consumption. That's number one. Number two is to ramp up revenue, because for a country like Nigeria, the game should be revenue, because we are so far down on government revenue as a proportion of GDP, 7%, when you should be aiming at 18, 20%. Then the third one is to diversify our economy. We need to diversify them as much as possible away from those Western economies, because that is where you are heading out to look for the forex, and then you have vulnerabilities across the region dependent on commodity trading. So that is common across the whole African region, the commodity trading. Now we need to diversify away, but we need to move to the direction of intra-African trade. Let us buy as much as we can from within the continent. There's virtually very little that you need that you cannot find within the continent somewhere. And since we now have PAPSS, which is a Pan-African Payment Settlement System, that means you don't really need to find a dollar to pay for these goods. You just the system is seamless. We are using Naira to pay for the goods coming from, capital goods coming from South Africa, electronic, so let's focus there and then use the likes of our swap, yuan swap with South Africa, not with China. So again, we are cutting down our request for dollar and use a swap arrangement with Naira yuan swap with China. So all of this will reduce the pressure on forex, on dollars, so that we have less recourse to dollars. I think that's the way we should go. We can't be comfortable with intra-regional trade of 13 to 14%, when at the same time as Europe, we move from 10 to 13, 14, they move from 10 to 70% intra-regional trade. So we need to focus on what we can do. Do joint ventures with our neighbors. Have a refinery in the neighboring countries so that you send them the crude to refine. If we don't want to refine in Nigeria, help them to set up their own refineries. So there are much more things we could do within ourselves.
Professor Ken Ife, we will drill into key immediate issues of energy and food sustainability when we return. This is very key. Stand by, everyone. We'll be right back. Global trade faces expensive food price subsidies and even export bans on food products. The World Bank says this should stop, while the bank is providing some $170 billion per year to strengthen $17 billion to strengthen food security. Continuing my chat with Professor Ken Ife, development economist from Abuja studios, on the agenda for the World Bank IMF spring meetings already on the way. Thank you, Professor. Two key areas highlighted by the ongoing crisis. One, energy sustainability. Two, food production. You mentioned that in the first part of our conversation. Let's start with food or agriculture. How urgent is this for you as a development economist? What do you think?
Agriculture is a basic need. The food is a basic need, just like clothing and shelter. You haven't got anywhere to run to. If you can't eat within a matter of hours, then the heat will be on. So it's so critical that we address all the challenges around agriculture, because it's getting worse. The climate change throws a spanner in the works. The conflict in all the geopolitical zones messes everybody up and drives away the people who grow the food. And then you also have the general imported inflation and all the knock-on effect. Even the petrol situation helps to push prices of transportation up, prices of transportation pushing the price of food up, and the whole thing meets in one point, and that is inflation. Inflation just delivers the final blow, because you have money, some don't have money. Those that have money can't buy much with the money because of inflation. And I've had families that are spending 65% of their income on utilities. This is getting unacceptable.
You're getting unacceptable. What the World Bank and the IMF have said over the last 1 week or so is to reiterate the need for economies to start thinking very seriously and working hard at producing food locally. Because if there's one lesson from the Ukraine crisis brought about by the Russian aggression operations in Ukraine, is the fact that you need to grow your food in your backyard. Yes or no?
Yeah, in fact, that is the answer. Because look at how privileged we are, that in many of our agroecology, you don't even need fertilizer. We have fertilizer-free zones in Edo State, in many of the southern belts. But there are countries up there in the Arctic and Antarctic that don't even have a chance of growing anything. They have to grow them in greenhouse, in water, called aquaponics. But here we have land. You drop any piece of fruit thing, it grows on its own. You don't even need to farm. So we are so blessed, but we're doing not a great deal to challenge the situation. Of course, I know the central bank is doing a Koborwa's program and pushing the post really hard. So, but we need to take this whole matter very, very serious, because we have to look at the whole value chain. It's not just food production. But if you don't process that food, it means that you are down to raw material trading with commodities. But if you process it, you add value. And the difference is phenomenal. And once you create the industrial base, you have sitting already on top of it is the service sector multipliers. Is a multiplier effect. So I don't think you can say it any better than they have said in the World Bank meeting.
Also, how is energy and food sustainability linked with extreme poverty, economic fragility for poor countries, rising insecurity, and other such problems?
Well, the link, the obvious link between the energy crisis and food sustainability issue is inflation. Inflation is the thread linking the two, because the energy cost, rising energy costs, affects transportation system. Transportation is used to carry food. Then the food itself has its own challenges around insecurity, and there's so many. But the meeting point is inflation. And inflation, I said to you before, there are people that don't even have any income. Then there are some that have very little and is all eaten up by inflation. So we need to tackle this head on, because we don't have much chance. The risk is social upheaval and political violence, apart from the obvious tendency to worsen the numbers around what would you call it, people living below poverty line. In fact, the bank actually suggested from their study that a 1% increase in the price of food sends 10 million people into poverty. So that's a frightening scenario in a country where we have
very frightening scenario. Oxfam last week, which is that world advocacy group and all that, says that look, there's going to be more poverty will increase globally this year, 2022. Here is Nigerian government talking about lifting 100 million people out of poverty, 10 million people per year. And here we're heading to an elections in 2023. So by this time in next year or thereabout. So what's your take? What's your 411 for the new administration, looking at all these global vulnerabilities and headwinds that we currently face, and where we are right now, about what you're hearing on the ground about those who want to be the new CEO for corporate Nigeria?
Well, it does show from all indications that the rate at which we are entering into poverty may well be exceeding the rate at which we are getting people out of poverty. But I did hear a figure of 22 million more people are going to be, affected by the new social investment program. So we just have to keep our fingers crossed. But we need to do more. There's absolutely no doubt that we need to do more.
In what areas would you like us to do more as we move into a new administration next year? Give me a few. What's on your top on your list?
One is that we have to focus on diversifying our economy, because the monocultural economy of this sort, which is crude, that is exogenic, and we have no control over the prices, neither do we have control over the production volume. In fact, you've seen what is going on with our production volume.
We've talked about diversification for so long, Professor Ken Ife. We've talked about diversification.
So,
what needs to change with our diversification process?
Let me tell you about the diversification.
Yes, please.
There are two perspectives on our diversification. On the domestic front, the economy is actually more diverse than we give credit to. One is that the oil, which is everybody's bane, has dropped to 7.49% of the GDP. Then you have others like the trade is 16%, ICT is 15%, manufacturing is over 10%. So there are many sectors that are over 15%. So there is diversifying. But where we haven't got diversification is on the external sector, because that is where you want to have more impact on our forex revenue. We need for forex revenue to prosecute the war. We need it to buy machineries and equipment. We need it for critical invisible expense. So, but we don't have that level of diversification. Of course, you can now say, yes, CBN has brought a program of RT $200 billion a year, which is over the next 3 to 5 years. So that may bring a ray of hope. And then let's hope that after, I saw some sign yesterday that they released some billions of naira incentives. So let's hope that comes on stream and pretty fast. Because the devastation around the forex mismatch, the demand and supply mismatch of our forex, makes the situation look very hopeless. When you have demand and supply that have no chance of converging and they are divergent, then you can't talk about floating your currency.
Professor Ken Ife, that's a very touching point where you talk about hope and hopelessness. But let's hope we've been able to give hope to everyone tonight on the show. We thank you so much for your insights into these global socio-economic headlines and their ramifications for Frontier Africa.